Hi, and welcome back. These days, there are so many different modules available, you always have a choice between basic and more complex versions of essential building blocks. Today, we're having a closer look at a complex LFO by Thorn Audio, and we'll explore what we can do with it. First, I'll go over the functions and features of the module. Then we'll dive into a series of patches, and finally, I'll give you my personal thoughts on the module. If you'd like to support this video series, or you want to get access to the PDF sheets of the illustrations I use in this and many of my other videos, have a look at my Patreon. But now, let's dive right in. As you can see from the front panel, there is a lot more going on here than on a simple LFO. But let's start from the top. There's a frequency control right here, and a range switch for the frequency, called octave. If you did your homework on music theory, you know that with each octave up, the frequency is doubled. So on an LFO, this is useful to create time-based divisions. There's a voltage control input for the frequency, as well as the octave switch. The big rotary switch here lets you pick from 8 waveforms. And there's a switch that gives you access to 8 more. In most cases, these are cleverly related to the first. Again, there's a voltage control input for the waveform selection, as well as a gate input to switch between the normal and alternate waveforms. You can pause this screen if you like to have a closer look at the available options. But note, there is also a noise and slewed random voltage. Switching between waveforms is immediate without morphing. But you have additional wave shaping options over all of the waveforms with the skew control here. That also has a CV input. This can turn a simple sine in a spiky version, or a triangle into a saw, for example. Then there's a level control. This is an internal VCA before the output of the module. You can use it manually, so no attenuation on the destination is needed. Or use the voltage control input here to add a simple delay, for example. Or add complex motion to the modulation amount. And then there is an integrated sample and hold circuit. This uses the selected waveforms as the input for the sample and hold. This knob here lets you set the clock rate independent from the LFO speed. Fully to the right, the speed is so fast you basically get a regular LFO. But settings more to the left slow the sample and hold rate down, like a bitrate reducer. Again, there's a CV input for this. Here is that effect on a sine wave. Here at the bottom left, you can also find the sync input. And this one deserves some special attention, because it comes with its own switch that lets you set the sync behavior, from off to sync either the LFO or sample and hold, or sync both. As for the LFO, the sync is a straightforward hard sync. The waveform resets at each clock input. This gives you additional wave shaping options, like this 3/4 sine wave example. But when syncing the sample and hold circuit, you get some experimental options. When the internal sample and hold rate is slower than the sync input, each pulse will give you a new value. But as soon as the internal clock is faster than the sync pulse, you can get multiple values before the circuit restarts. experimenting with syncing both the LFO as well as the sample and hold with a faster speed allows for the creation of interesting looping patterns. Finally, there are the outputs here in red. There's a regular output of the LFO, an inverted version of that, and an output called gate out. This produces an on-off gate signal, but because it's made with a comparator based on the final output, it's influenced by the waveform, level, skew, and sample and hold settings as well. For example, using a simple sine wave will result in a steady clock, but applying skew to the sine will result in pulse width style modulation. Complex waveforms, sample and hold signals, or of course random voltages will result in creative gate patterns. So the module offers a lot of different waveforms, but it also does noise, sample and hold, and random voltages. More importantly, it offers voltage control over all its features, and that gives you the possibility to create complex automated patches. A while ago, I did a video on the importance of having voltage control over the speed of your LFO. Make sure to watch that video later if you haven't done it yet. But now I'm going to dive straight into more complex patches, modulating the waveform and wave shape. Here is a simple drone voice, made with an oscillator and filter, and sequenced by a 3-step sequencer. The VCLFO is used to modulate the filter. To add some interesting dynamics over time, a slow random gate pattern is used to switch between the regular and alternate waveforms. And a slow smooth random voltage is modulating the frequency of the VCLFO, as well as the filter. Here's the same setup with a simple voice, and the VCLFO modulating the filter. By adding a clock and a clock divider, you can add a lot of tempo synced modulation. For example, use a mixer to mix two different divisions together and send the mix to the wave select. Use a faster division to sync the LFO and use the clock to sync the sequencer as well. Finally, a smooth random voltage to the octave switch input is used to create additional time divisions. Here, a very similar setup is used. Again, a clock is driving the sequencer and clock divider, with a mix of two divisions making a pattern for the wave select. Only this time, the frequency of the VCLFO isn't synced, and used at moderate audio rates to create a changing pattern of subtle textures. In addition, a division is used to trigger a kick, as well as an inverted envelope to duck the filter for a bit of a pumping effect. Using synced patterns to create melodies is also fun. This time use a quantizer triggered by a steady clock to sequence the simple voice. And use the VCLFO to feed the quantizer voltages to quantize. Again, use a clock divider to send a slow division to the wave to switch waveforms. Use a division to sync the VCLFO and create repeating patterns. And finally, use an LFO through an attenuator to modulate the skew slightly, to create subtle variations in the looping patterns. Let's make another drone patch, this time with an oscillator with analog wavefolding and a bandpass filter. You can use multiple outputs of the VCLFO to modulate different parameters in a patch at the same time. For example, use the gate out to modulate the folder on the oscillator. Use the main out to modulate the frequency of the filter and the inverted out to modulate the bandwidth of the bandpass filter. Use another LFO to modulate the wave shape of the VCLFO and the smooth random voltage through an attenuator to modulate the frequency. fluctuating random voltage among the wave shapes is great. In this case, the VCLFO's regular output is used to modulate a wavetable oscillator, as well as the frequency of a bandpass filter. Two simple free-running LFOs are used to modulate the speed and level of the random voltage. And finally, a square wave LFO with a narrow pulse width is used to modulate the waveform. Mostly, the fluctuating random voltage is selected, but occasionally it switches to alternate square out. I enjoy working with clocks and dividers, but there are many ways to modulate the VCLFO. Sequencers, for example, can be used to create precise predictable patterns. In this patch, two sequencers are used. Their clock is used to sync the VCLFO. One sequence is selecting a higher octave for 1 out of 4 steps, and the 7-step sequence is used to switch between waveforms. The clock is also triggering some drum samples. The sample and hold is another aspect that makes the VCLFO unique. Again, especially because you have voltage control over all its parameters. Here are just a few ideas. Let's use the same drone setup as we used before. In order to create a straightforward sample and hold, you can set the waveform of the VCLFO to noise, the rate to slow, and use a clock to the sync to trigger a new value. But you can create more interesting dynamics by modulating parameters. For example, use a slow LFO to modulate the level, and a smooth random voltage to modulate the sample and hold rate. Both signals are attenuated externally to create a more subtle effect. But instead of noise, you can use other internal waveforms as the source of the sample and hold circuit, and another LFO to modulate the sample rate. With the right balance, you can have something like a slow sine wave fall apart in the sample and hold signal, and slowly bounce back to a regular sine. Just for fun, let's expand that patch into a more musical setting by adding a sequencer triggered by a clock. The clock is advancing a divider that is used to sync the speed of the LFO. So, to be clear, not the sample and hold rate. That is still controlled by the regular LFO. A second oscillator is added for some subtle FM. And finally, the divider also triggers some drum samples for good measure. Here is a simple voice, made with an oscillator, wave folder, filter, and again a second oscillator for FM. This time the VCLFO is used to modulate the folder. Like in the last patch, a free-running LFO is used to modulate the sample and hold rate, and the sequencer, clock and clock divider are used to sync the VCLFO and switch between a rising and falling ramp. Here is a similar voice, but without FM. Again, the VCLFO is modulating the folder. A clock and divider are used to create a division to sync the VCLFO. In this case, both the LFO and the sample and hold are synced. but the sample and hold rate is set to a faster speed than the incoming clock, resulting into a steady looping pattern. By adding modulation, you can create variations to this pattern. For example, use a slow division through an attenuator to switch to a higher octave, and use a slow unsynced square wave LFO as a gate pattern to switch to the alternate waveform. Because the gate is based on the final output of the module, it can be modulated. And of course, gate outputs can also be used as modulation source as well as triggers. In this drone setup, the VCLFO is used as the master clock and pattern generator. The gate output is modulating a wavetable oscillator, passing through a bandpass filter. An attenuated LFO is used to modulate the skew and create subtle differences in the pattern. At the same time, a multiplication of the gate signal is used to forward the clock divider that triggers a slow envelope modulating the frequency of the bandpass filter. And another copy of the gate is used in the logic module. Another LFO is determining whether the gate passes on to another short plucky envelope, controlling the gain of the bandpass filter. Following the wave shape, it's worth it to experiment with different waveforms to create trigger patterns. In this patch, the gate output of the VCLFO is both modulating a filter and triggering a head. A clock is used to sync the LFO, and a free-running LFO is used to modulate the skew to have the pattern drift around a bit. It's quite fun to use the gates to create all sorts of semi-synced organic patterns. You can try modulating the speed to create drift, the sample and hold to mangle the pattern, the octave to create fills, and with something like an LFO to the level, you can occasionally turn the gate signal off. The patches in this video are really just scratching the surface of the possibilities. But I hope to have shown that the VCLFO is so much more than an LFO. With all the CV inputs that it offers, it's much more like a complex voltage and pattern generator. Of course, it can bring some simple movement to a patch as well, but you can find cheaper and more compact options for that. In fact, you even need some additional simple modulation to get the most out of the VCLFO. But unlike a simple LFO, this module can easily be at the core of a sound or patch and inspire you to explore new territory. I think it's these kind of modules that stray away from the basics that make modular synthesizers so interesting. If you'd like to learn more about things like clock dividers or modular utilities, have a look at any of these videos. Also, smash that like, subscribe and bell button if you want to see more modular content from me. But that's it for now. Thanks for watching and see you next time.